many of us noticed that a pretty strong wind blew through this week, right? There you go. How many of us are fans or not so much? Okay. Yeah, some people, right? Fans? Yeah. I stooped that low. Yeah. When I was growing up in Southern California, we had a pretty regular strong wind called the Santa Ana winds. Anyone know about the Santa Anas? Yeah. So I grew up expecting it, and my grandmother, her backyard was just full wall to wall of potted plants. And so every time the Santa Ana winds would blow, the entire backyard would just become complete chaos. Some would break, some would fall apart. And I used to wonder, like, why does she put up with this? Because then afterwards, every day after the Santa Ana would come through, we'd all just that was our project. We'd all get everything back together. And I started to realize that, as I grew up, I realized that my grandmother's love language is acts of service. And more specifically, I think her love language is having her grandson move her potted plants for her. So I realized that the Santa Anas worked in her favor. But for some of us, the winds are quite an inconvenience. But for nature loves the wind. Wind is great for nature. It stirs things up. It clears things out. It stimulates life and growth. It moves seeds to different places. And really, the wind gives life. And I wonder if we could adopt that perspective for ourselves, to see that maybe sometimes in life we need things to be a little stirred up, right? We need some things to be cleared. Sometimes the wind of life can be healthy and stimulating for us. And there's a very specific part of nature that has this really incredible relationship with trees. I mean, yes, wind, trees, they have a relationship. Nature is trees. Nature is wind. And starting over. There's an incredible part of nature that has this incredible relationship with wind, and that is trees. Okay, that was the way I meant to say it. Woohoo! So here's the deal. Biosphere II, which is right down the street for some of us, was this incredible science project. And if you don't live here, if you're watching online, you're not local, Biosphere II is this incredible science project that was really about discovering how can we recreate aspects of the ecological process of the earth in a controlled environment. But the thing is, being a controlled environment, there were just certain factors about life on earth that could not be replicated in Biosphere II. And one of those things was wind. There was no way of implementing wind in the biosphere. And so what happened was that these trees in biosphere would grow incredibly tall, incredibly fast, and then at a certain point, they would just fall over. And what the researchers discovered, and this is why Biosphere really was an incredible success, despite not exactly completing its mission as it had initially portrayed it, but it was still an incredible success because of all the knowledge gained. And one of those things that they learned from Biosphere is that when trees are impacted by wind, when trees experience the stress and wind causes them to brace themselves over and over again, it actually strengthens the tree. It actually deepens the roots, and it creates what we know as stress wood. Travis Brownley from the Marin Academy says this: without stress wood, a tree can grow quickly, but it cannot support itself fully. It cannot withstand normal wear and tear and survive. In other words, the trees needed some stress in order to thrive in the long run. Does this sound familiar for our own lives and our own journeys? Sometimes the winds of life blow, and yet the way in which we extend our roots and brace ourselves from this wind actually causes us to thrive in the long run. When in your life has some exposure to some wind been good for you? When in your life have the winds actually caused your roots to grow deeper? When facing external pressure actually grounded you? Because, friends, the winds are guaranteed. Jesus said of anyone following, this spiritual path is like a wise man who built his house on a rock, on a firm foundation. when storms hit, rain pounded down, and waters rose, levees broke, and winds beat all the walls of that house. But the house did not fall because it was built upon rock. Jesus didn't say the spiritual path is one without wind, is one without weather. No, he says the spiritual path is one that anticipates wind and then finds a deep spiritual groundedness. Friends, what if thriving is not about how much wind we can avoid, but how much wind we can allow to shape us, to ground us, to deepen our experience? A word that I've really found helpful in my own journey when I think about the winds of life is this word disruption. See, we all experience disruptions, things that don't go as planned, or things that happen in our life that are not the preferred outcome, things that we may even, at the time, think of as irredeemable. There is no good that can come out of this situation. And that word disruption comes from the Latin disrompere, which means to break apart, to shatter. Sometimes, friends, our plans get shattered. Sometimes our ideas about ourselves get disrupted. Sometimes our family dynamics, our career situations, our life path, it gets broken up, broken apart, disintegrated. And yet, for how many of us have we been able to take a step back, look at our own histories, and recognize that there were times in our lives when our path got shaken up a little bit, and we could say, you know what? Maybe that disruption actually needed to happen. Maybe that disruption was part of a larger process in my life that led me to a greater good. See, disruptions will come, friends. And the assumption that we generally tend to make when they present themselves is, this is bad, right? And yet, who is the person that's judging the situation? Who is the person making that assumption? It's us, right? And tell me this, be honest, what's your track record on judging a situation by its cover, right? What's your track record on making assumptions on how situations are going to turn out right when they present themselves? You know what they say happens when you assume. I'll leave it at that. See, here's what happens over time. We look back and we realize that the things we never would have wanted actually became central to our stories. The things that at the time we would have done anything to get out of that situation become the parts of our stories that we wouldn't change. Because, friends, I think if you were to go back and you were to say, if I could just change that one thing, wouldn't that be so nice? But really, if you were to change one thing, you'd have to be willing to watch it all change. You know, in physics, there's this metaphor called the butterfly effect. And it basically comes from this idea. It's a bit of a metaphor, but it's this idea that the flapping of the wings of a butterfly could have an effect on the trajectory of a tornado miles away. And it's really this idea to remind us that the littlest of changes in circumstances can really have massive effects on our lives. You know, sometimes I take this to heart maybe a little too seriously. The server is saying, do you want soup or salad? And I'm thinking, gosh, if I make the wrong decision, I don't know. If I make the right decision, I could end up president. Or maybe that's the wrong decision. I don't know. But see, think about your life and think about what were those situations where you could even look at that one situation and say, man, if I were to change that, everything in my life would be different. For me, I look back, maybe it's middle school when my friend group that I'd grown up with all of a sudden imploded and I felt like I had no one. And yet, because of that, the new friends that I found just a year later ended up changing the trajectory of my life for the better. Or maybe it was that time in my early 20s when I really started to experience a loss of faith and a deconstruction of what I had believed. And yet, that experience actually opened me up to a new spiritual path that is still so near and dear to my heart. Or maybe it was just a few years ago during the pandemic when the plans that I had for my life imploded and derailed. And yet, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you today. Friends, how often is disruption a gift? How often is it that some things in our lives need to break apart? Sometimes we need the wind to blow. And yet, through conversations that I've had with so many of you, and I'm sure you've recognized this, we can do a pretty good job of looking back and saying, oh yeah, I can see how that difficult situation ended up working for my good. We do a good job of recognizing this retroactively. But what would it be like if we could become a little more proactive about that type of awareness? The moment that difficulties come, what if we could say, I don't know just yet how this situation is going to be turned into something good, but I am going to trust because I've seen it happen before. Friends, I don't think real faith, when I think about that word faith, I don't think real faith is about having the right set of beliefs. I think it's more about a trust and a confidence that even when things fall apart, we might say, you know what? Maybe this needs to fall apart a little bit. Maybe when the wind blows, what it's actually doing is creating some very important stress wood in my life. The poet and ecological theologian Wendell Berry wrote a poem where he shares this, and I need to turn my thing on to get there. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. Friends, how often does life feel like an impeded stream? How many of us like to have things planned out to a T? Yeah. And the rest of you are lying. And we've all experienced those plans being blocked, being rerouted, being spoiled in some way. And we've all been in that situation where we try to save the plan, right? We try to hold on to the plan. No, this is going to work, I promise. But we may have also seen those moments where we let go, we trusted, and we allowed the new path to take us somewhere. The impeded stream ended up taking us in a new direction. That's when life really begins to sing. That's when the music of the universe really comes through and we start to allow the new plan to come forth. In the 1950s, spiritual author Alan Watts wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And the subtitle of that book is A Message for the Age of Anxiety. And I think it's so interesting that he wrote that book in the 50s, when today it's really just as relevant, if not more so. And, it's an interesting title. You might think The Wisdom of Insecurity, but really what he was saying is that sometimes security is an illusion. We fight so hard and hold on to certainty and security, hoping that things will never change, but change is guaranteed. Change is promised, and there is actually a hope and a wisdom and a depth when we can let go into change. And this is what he says, and I think it really kind of helpfully encapsulates the ideas of this book. He says, I have always been fascinated by the law of reversed effort. Sometimes I call it the backwards law. When you try to stay on the surface of the water, you sink. But when you try to sink, you float. When you hold your breath, you lose it, which immediately calls to mind an ancient and much neglected saying, whosoever would save his soul shall lose it. Sometimes, friends, when we hold on to plans, we lose the heart of the plan. Sometimes when we place expectations on situations or on people, we blind ourselves to what's actually happening in the moment. For some of us, this has been the very experience of religion that we've had. How many of us at different times felt that in order to experience safety and security, that we needed to have the right belief in God, the exact correct belief? And yet, this idea, the wisdom of insecurity, I think points us to this understanding that maybe divine connection is actually found in a space beyond security, beyond our ideas of security. For security is a human word and a human concept. And isn't the divine beyond concepts? See, Alan Watts goes on in that book to say this: if we cling to belief in God, we cannot likewise have faith, since faith is not clinging, but letting go. How many of us have experienced that clinging? Yeah. And sometimes that clinging makes it so that we can't even embrace and entertain our own questions, our own curiosities. I remember growing up, I've always loved stand-up comedy. Plug for the stand-up comedy class. You should do it. I think it's a beautiful way for us to express ourselves, and I've always loved it. And, I'd watch it with my parents, and it's interesting because it's still true today, but it was especially true 10, 20 years ago, where I feel like every comedian in their special would reserve 5 or 10 minutes for some God jokes and some religion jokes. And, at the time, like now looking back, I'm like, that's all really funny and really good stuff. But at the time, I had to act as though I was super offended by it all. So me and my parents would be watching these specials, and then they'd get to their religion jokes, and I'd have to be like, oh, man, I'll just pray for them, Gosh, that's just, it's so sad. It's just so sad. Now I'm like, good point that they made. But see, friends, we have this mentality, we have this orientation to belief sometimes where we don't allow ourselves to hold any questions, to hold any challenges. There's a mentor of mine who, he even says, when we spend all our energy defending something, we have our back to it. We're not even experiencing it. We're not even enjoying it. Our modern concept and our modern understanding of free speech is actually pretty strongly influenced by an English philosopher named John Stuart Mill, who lived in the 1800s. And Mill actually, he not only felt that free speech was the right thing to do as an expression of freedom, but he also felt that when we entertain views that are different from ours, it actually just helps us understand more what we believe. And in fact, this is a way that he argued for this point. He said, they who only knows their own side of the case knows little of that. In other words, if all you know is what you believe and you can't hear anything else, do you even really know what you believe? If all you tolerate are people that agree with you or support your side of things, and you can't hear the opposite argument, do you even really know what you believe? See, today, how many of us can look at institutions in our world that cannot be criticized? Maybe people that cannot be criticized or challenged. Maybe for most of us, we grew up with a God that couldn't be criticized, that couldn't handle doubts or questions. Mill says that when we live in this way, our beliefs, they turn into what he would call a dead dogma. It's not living. It's not breathing. We don't even have a relationship with it. And likewise, friends, I think that we don't truly know what we value until life challenges us, until the winds blow and they call our values into question. See, it can be really easy to come in here on a Sunday morning and say, love is the highest value, love, period. How many of you then on Monday morning experience someone that's hard to love, right? And that challenge actually asks you and invites you to say, do you really believe this? How much of a value is this? See, friends, if all we do is protect ourselves from being challenged, whether that's from other people or whether that's from life itself, I believe that we're not having a true experience of our values, of our beliefs, of life. And actually, a really beautiful thing can happen when we are challenged, and maybe it does cause our values to change a little bit, our beliefs to change a little bit. I think that that's something worth celebrating because it means that you have encountered something that within your own heart you recognize as being maybe truer to you or better. The author Malcolm Gladwell says, I feel I change my mind all the time. And I sort of feel that's your responsibility as a human, as a person, as a human being, to constantly be updating your positions on as many things as possible. And if you don't contradict yourself on a regular basis, then you're not thinking. When we spend life avoiding that experience, when we spend life avoiding pain, mitigating loss, when we spend life fighting uncertainty, clinging to belief, it just leaves us exhausted, and it leaves us disconnected with ourselves and with the very heart of the things we value the most. But when we allow the challenge, when we allow the wind, when we allow the discomfort, when we allow the uncertainty, we are present with what's happening in our lives, and we are available to see new possibilities and to see the transformation that's possible. And when I think of this type of transformation that comes through challenge, there's a metaphor that has been really strong, that I've really related to and connected with, and this metaphor is alchemy. Now, alchemy is something that we get from medieval times, not the restaurant, but the era. Okay, I'm sorry. That was a bad one. It's a medieval philosophy, and it's something that we would almost think of as like a proto-chemistry, meaning it comes before chemistry. And we have a chemistry teacher present, and again, she's probably going to come correct me afterwards. But it's very important to know this is not chemistry, but it was in an era before modern technology, before modern science. It was a type of chemistry in which these alchemists, what they were trying to do was they were trying to take these less precious metals and transform them into more precious metals. As a science, it didn't really work all that well, okay? Now, I don't want you to go home and be like, hey, Jake told us to try alchemy, and then you blow up your house and you sue me. I'm not saying to do it. But what I am saying is that in spirituality and in psychology, many have found the metaphor of alchemy to be incredibly powerful, not the least of which was Carl Jung, who said this: only by discovering alchemy have I clearly understood the real metamorphosis of the psyche. See, alchemists, they were in the business of metamorphosis and in the business of transformation. And see, the concept that they used was that they would take these less precious metals, this scrap metal, if you will, they would heat it until a point where it was reduced to its most pure form in order to transform it. And when I think about the alchemy of the soul, how sometimes in life, we are handed junk metal, scrap metal. And the winds of life, the challenges of life, the situations that we are faced with, they turn up the heat, right? And we're faced with this moment where we are reduced. Sometimes things are stripped away, where we are reduced to the most purest form of who we are, the most purest form of what we value. And through the difficulty, through the change, through the uncertainty, through the uncomfortability, we alchemize these difficult situations in our life, and this scrap metal that we are handed is turned into gold. See, friends, for some of you, you grew up, maybe throughout your childhood, you grew up without much, right? You grew up in poverty, you grew up in difficult situations, and you alchemized that. So now, instead of that making you a greedier person, it made you a more generous person because you alchemized that difficulty into something beautiful. Maybe you're someone who's faced loss in your life, and instead of that making you afraid of losing anything more, it actually invited you to be grateful for the gift of life, alchemizing that pain. Maybe you're someone who was hurt by church, hurt by religion, and instead of that making you less loving, it's made you more loving, more open to community, more open to connection. See, friends, there are times in our life when we are just surviving, when we are living in survival mode, and we are handed scrap metal, and that's all that we can see. But thrival sees the gold. It sees what can become. Where survival just sees the wind, thrival sees the depth of the roots. Where survival just sees inconvenience, thrival sees opportunity. Rumi, in his poem, The Undressing, says this: learn the alchemy true human beings know. The moment you accept what troubles you have been given, the door opens. Friends, the winds of life are a catalyst for this alchemy that we can experience. The opportunity to transform, to open doors. And I think one of the most direct and personal images we have for transformation in this way is the breath, because in the breath we must let go in order to receive. And isn't that always how transformation works? Isn't that how alchemy works? So what I want to do today as we close is I want to just take a couple breaths together. And as we do, I want us to bring to mind and hold in our hearts those situations that we might be facing of difficulty, of disruption, of change. And as we inhale, we can feel and be honest with ourselves. And as we exhale, we can release the fear. We can release the expectations. You take a deep breath, and we acknowledge the disruption and the change of plans. And as we exhale expectations, we exhale assumptions. We take a deep breath, acknowledging the wind blowing in our lives. And as we exhale, we see the wind stirring us, bringing us to life. As we inhale, we acknowledge the places within us that are uncertain, that are holding on, that are clinging. And as we exhale, we acknowledge that we are held and supported by God, by the universe, by the source of all life. We just take a few more breaths together. The breath is one of the greatest gifts we have because we can always come back to it. We can always attach to it these images. So even throughout your day, as you feel these things come up, you can breathe in and you can breathe out as an opportunity to let go.